Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Rolling Stones record, Hackney Diamonds. It seemed like the Rolling Stones' return to the studio to put out new original music was inevitable at some point or another, because ignoring 2016's Blue and Lonesome, a solid blues cover album that I would actually recommend, the last album full of original material that they put out was 2005's A Bigger Bang, and that just didn't really seem like a good place to end the studio career of one of the most successful bands of all time, and not only that, but one of the most successful actively touring bands of all time. I mean, not even the death of longtime drummer Charlie Watts was going to prevent the Stones from getting into the studio at some point or another and finally putting out another album of entirely fresh, original songs. That being said, does Hackney Diamonds have any reason to exist beyond further deepening their catalog and producing more ticket sales for their already stadium selling out shows? Not really. Hackney Diamonds, their first album of entirely original material in nearly 20 years, shows the cracks in the Stones' studio abilities that have largely been invisible due to their lack of original releases in the past 18 years. But here, those cracks shine as bright as day, even if they don't necessarily make for a particularly horrible album either. While there are a variety of faults that can be pretty easily found throughout the entirety of this record's runtime, there is perhaps no bigger contributor or culprit towards creating this sense of non-essential existence within Hackney Diamonds than none other than Mick Jagger himself, the legendary frontman that has arguably been the voice of a generation of rock musicians. While the Stones may not be my favorite band in the world, Mick Jagger is rightfully considered one of the all-time great frontmen. He's a perfect example of a technically middling vocalist being elevated to amazing status due to pure charisma, pure energy. I mean, this guy's personality is really the combination of every single 20-something cokehead alcoholic combined into one single individual, or at least it was when the Stones were still a super youthful band, and when they were still making incredibly rowdy music for their time. Obviously, things have changed, and understandably so. I mean, times have changed, so has Jagger himself, and as such, of course, his vocals have changed. He's become a bit more restrained, a bit more dialed back in terms of delivery, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anything he does has to be inherently bad. In fact, that's the exact kind of thing I would expect from a guy who, again, has never really been known for his technical prowess, but rather his pure energy. That's just something that kind of naturally happens, unless your name's Iggy Pop, in which case you just kind of stay insane forever. That being said, aging does not automatically mean Mick Jagger has become a totally incompetent vocalist or anything like that. I think you could especially praise his abilities to sing more mournful and ballad-like songs, something that he's been great at since his 20s and is still great at as he enters his 80s. And perhaps he could have delivered some great performances in that vein, in that sort of Wild Horses-esque kind of style on tracks here like Dreamy Skies and Depending on You, songs that really do follow in that particular lane. At least I feel like he would have if he didn't sound absolutely bored out of his skull. Those moments are boring at best, but his absolute worst moments as a vocalist come in tracks like the lead single Angry, for example, where his vocals are so ridiculously processed while not being outright heavily auto-tuned that it almost feels like a sort of AI replicant spitting a Mick Jagger impression back out at you. There is still some humanity left in his voice, don't get me wrong. It's not like they're making him sound like one of the Daft Punk tracks that has vocals on it, but at the same time, it definitely doesn't come across as totally natural either. In fact, it kind of feels like Mick Jagger is a bit of a different person on those songs. Even in his better moments here, a lot of Jagger's passion feels lost. It doesn't really feel like he's having a ton of fun with it or anything like that. It's sort of just him going through the motions as a frontman and as a vocalist, as a performer in general. And even on songs where it feels like he could realistically deliver a really solid performance, he just kind of holds back and really doesn't add any emotion or depth to the songs that he's delivering, both in terms of actual vocal performance and in terms of just personality. And that's not to say that Mick Jagger has become a terrible vocalist in recent years or anything like that, which is something that could be said about a lot of his 60s and 70s classic rock peers. It just really feels like he doesn't want to be here on Hackney Diamonds, and while I'm sure that he probably did, at least to some extent, I mean, the man recorded the album, he had to have wanted to be there, kind of. It's not like they had to make another album to make more money, I'm sure they have enough. But really, it just doesn't necessarily feel like he's totally committed to the bit here. He's not really delivering any striking ballad performances, and the tracks that are a bit more adjacent towards that 70s country roots blues rock kind of thing that the Stones had going on throughout the most of that decade, they just kind of feel like Jagger doing an impression of himself from the time period, and not a particularly good one at that. I mean, Hackney Diamonds as a record just fails to play to his strengths as a vocalist and frontman. I mean, in terms of actual vocal ability, he can do great at actual ballad-like tracks, again, very mournful, more heavily country-influenced tracks. I really do believe that Jagger can pull off some great stuff there when he's really pushing himself, but those moments are few and far between in this record, and he doesn't sound particularly interested in giving it his all there, whereas the other more up-tempo kind of cuts, they just don't suit his voice in the current day. I mean, really, in the few moments where he is given an instrumental/musical backdrop that feels more suitable for how he's capable of performing technically today, it just doesn't feel like he's totally present, to say the least. That being said, for as much as I've ranted about Mick Jagger up to this point, he's not the only person to blame here. Guitarists Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood are equally people who contribute towards the flaccidity of this record, if you will. Similar to Mick Jagger as a vocalist, Richards and Wood as guitarists are far from being the greatest from a technical standpoint, but they are understandably ranked among the greats of their kind, because they have this charisma and raw energy that really pushes them beyond the limits that most hyper-technical music theory level guitarists could ever hope to achieve. They can be amazing instrumentalists with great riffs and a lot of really iconic moments throughout their career. That being said, they need the opportunity to provide the sort of manic, bluesy country energy that they just don't get on Hackney Diamonds. It's really a tragedy, because there's hints of greatness, just never a full dive into it. You have songs like Get Close and Driving Me Too Hard that either lack memorable riffs or particularly highlight the sloppy playing of both, especially in the lead guitar parts, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in concept. Again, the Stones have intentionally never been the musically tightest band in the world, but at the same time, when you don't have anything particularly memorable or particularly striking in terms of guitar work throughout, it just adds up to exactly that, sloppy playing with really no direction. There's a difference between being raw and just not really caring. Most of the solos here feel drab at best, and the vast majority of the riffs delivered via rhythm guitar work, they don't really feel particularly distinguishable from the vast majority of middle-of-the-road, entirely forgettable country blues rock that you can find a huge amount of throughout the past several decades, dating back all the way to the 1960s, and even beforehand if you want to count the proto-country rock, blues rock kind of stuff. That isn't to mention Keith Richards' vocals on the track Tell Me Straight, without a doubt the worst song on the album. And you know what? A Richards vocal appearance throughout the Stones' discography is a very rare sighting. It's like finding a shiny Pokemon level rare. That being said, I think there's a reason for that, and Tell Me Straight kind of reminded me of that. By far one of the worst vocal performances I've heard from any artist all year. Again, I know the man's up there in age, but it's just outright terrible how he sings throughout the entirety of that track. It's pitchy, it's a bit off-kilter, but definitely not intentionally. And again, before I get people in the comments that are like, oh, but he's like 80-something, of course he's not the greatest vocalist. Mick Jagger doesn't sound great here, but he sounds fine. He just sounds like he has a lack of investment in this record. He's still a capable performer, he's just not totally there throughout Hackney Diamonds. Keith Richards just is straight up horrible here. I digress. Even on some of the more wobbling blues tracks here, like Live by the Sword, for example, Richards and Wood as guitarists don't really shine, even though it feels like at one point in their careers they would have been able to just absolutely kill it on those kinds of songs. But just like how Mick Jagger doesn't sound particularly invested in his vocal work, both guitarists on this record just don't sound like they're that interested in delivering anything beyond what you would expect from the Rolling Stones in 2023, and that's not anything especially great, if I'm being totally honest. At this point, the guitar work throughout the Rolling Stones' discography has gone from really raw, manic energy to the present day of average barroom rockers that kind of sound like a local band, maybe slightly above that level of ability and skill and enjoyability. And that's not a particularly great thing to be known for. Hackney Diamonds' primary issues don't come exclusively from the core members of the band, however. There are issues surrounding them that also affect them, and then you combine that with mediocre performances, and you get this album. First of all, much of the album sounds extremely compressed from a production standpoint, which causes any songs that have even the remote chance to be moving in one way or another to come across as just highly compressed, extremely flat, both musically and sonically, and it's a shame because I think with a better sense of quality in the audio here, there would be potential for some tracks to have a bigger impact overall, at least some of, again, those previously mentioned more ballad-like tracks. But as it stands, a lot of this record feels wildly one-dimensional, and I think that's a bit of a tragedy. There's also songs like Whole Wide World that just feel indistinct from a structural standpoint. They lack any bridges or choruses or hooks that really manage to sink your teeth into it, you know? It doesn't really feel like they kind of stick around. They don't let you feel really attached to them from any particular position in one way or another. But I think the worst, most egregious example of this record not really taking advantage of the great things that it could potentially have is the variety of limited but still completely wasted guest appearances found throughout it. Paul McCartney plays bass and provides no vocals on the entirely bass-lacking song Bite My Head Off. Elton John's piano work is so low in the mix on Live by the Sword that you wouldn't even be able to notice that it's there. He is not a Nicky Hopkins kind of figure for the Stones on this record, even though I'm assuming that's maybe what they wanted him to be. And lastly, Lady Gaga and Stevie Wonder's presence on Sweet Sounds of Heaven would be entirely unnoticeable if it weren't for the former's gospel-esque vocal deliveries at the end of the song. But Stevie Wonder is basically nowhere to be found on that if you're just a casual listener. You seriously gotta deep listen to these tracks to hear each of the individual guest appearances. And when you're pulling some of the most iconic, most talented, and most legendary artists throughout music history, I feel like you'd want to use them a little bit better. I mean, McCartney's got the kind of voice that would properly suit a modern Stones song. The Rolling Stones are also, again, not unfamiliar with piano work in their body of work at this point. I mean, again, Nicky Hopkins was a majorly essential aspect of a lot of the best work that came from the Stones at one point. And without him and his style of piano, albums like Let It Bleed would just not be the same overall. So I don't see why Elton John wasn't utilized in that same way. It just really feels like a waste of potential. All of the elements for a solid, albeit not great, Rolling Stones album in 2023 are absolutely here, all the way up to having equally legendary performers, some of the most iconic in music history, step up to the plate to help the Stones throughout the record, and somehow the band still managed to kind of fumble the ball here. I mean, obviously not everything is 100% the entire band's fault or anything like that, but at the same time, there are a lot of decisions here that I wouldn't necessarily say are poor choices of creative direction, but just confusing choices. I mean, why make it sound this compressed? Why have so many tracks that just don't suit Mick Jagger's voice whatsoever so obviously? Why have guest appearances from people that are barely audible in the songs that they're featured in? I have a lot of whys for this record. If you needed any evidence as to why you rarely hear people begging for a new Rolling Stones album of fresh material, despite them still being one of the most popular bands on the planet, their first album of fresh material in 18 years is probably what you're looking for. I mean, it kind of shows why they haven't done anything since A Bigger Bang. I kind of regret looking forward to this album, actually. Hackney Diamonds doesn't suffer from incompetent musicians working on it. There are a ton of excellent musicians on here. It doesn't suffer from a lack of creative direction. This is actually pretty predictable, albeit solid in terms of sound for the Stones, and it doesn't really suffer from any sense of lacking concept or anything like that. Again, the Stones went into this with a sort of blues rock, country rock style with some more melodic pop rock kind of sounds mixed in, and that's something they've participated in for literal decades at this point. It's just kind of the same old with different production. So it's not really any of those things, which leaves the question as to why did Hackney Diamonds turn out the way it did? I think ultimately the answer is that the Stones, despite not really needing to put out another album for money's sake or anything like that, felt a bit obligated, maybe, to put this out as a potential final album from a band that obviously don't really have any need or desire to do so. I mean, the band said what they needed to say and do what they needed to do long ago. You could argue that that period wrapped up by the 80s. But if there was ever a time for them to just tour and just kill it and not put out any new studio material, that time would be right now. Hackney Diamonds may be a fine album if you're a diehard Stones fan and you've been waiting for new original material from them for nearly 20 years, and you know what, their touring days are probably not that far behind them. In fact, they are right now. They're not going to stop anytime soon. I will die before the Stones stop touring. But that being said, Hackney Diamonds does have trouble standing up on its own two legs because it's an interesting example of a band that would go into the studio and seemingly produce a terrible album or a great comeback album, and instead come out with just nothing, really. A purely mediocre album that's heavily flawed, but still not the worst thing in the world. Just an album that results in a lot of questions and really not a lot of a reason to return to it. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.